On the morning of January 22nd, 1992, 25-year-old Stephanie Slater set out to meet a prospective buyer at a house in Turnberry Road. She was an estate agent in the small town of Great Barr in Birmingham, in the United Kingdom. Stephanie's job was to meet with prospective buyers or renters to showcase properties listed by the agency. These were appointment-based showings, so Stephanie would arrive at the property, meeting the person or persons interested in the property. Maybe it was just a man coming to view that day, a man and a wife and a sister. Maybe the whole family has come to have a look. But it would always be the same routine of meeting at the property. Introductions would be made. Nice to meet you, I'm Stephanie. Nice to meet you. Shall we have a look around? She might start with a brief overview of the property, how many rooms, bathrooms it has, what type of boiler is used, moving on to a tour of the exterior, pointing out a nice spot for where a shed could be placed, mentioning the amount of sunlight that the garden gets, next heading inside to the house to guide a tour around the rooms and highlight its features. Stephanie was used to this. This was her job. She did it every day. So why would it take her so much longer than usual to complete the viewing booked in for 10:30 that morning? Her colleagues are back at the office, wondering why she's not back yet. What's taking her so long? The booking was only a few streets away. But Stephanie didn't just return late. She didn't return at all. Stephanie Slater was born on the 4th of March 1966 in Birmingham, England. She was a World Cup baby. Adopted into a loving and supportive family, she lived with her dad Warren and her mum Betty. Stephanie was very close to her parents. They were a close-knit family, and apart from being adopted, Stephanie had a normal, loving upbringing. Both of her parents were well regarded in their community, and they'd get involved in local activities. If you knew the Slater family, you knew them to be good people. From a young age, Stephanie was known for her friendly and outgoing personality. She followed in her parents' footsteps by getting involved in community activities and started demonstrating an early interest in helping others and contributing to her community. In school, Stephanie was an enthusiastic student. She worked hard and she excelled in her subjects, doing especially well in maths and English. And alongside her studies, she pushed herself to take part in various extracurricular activities. Stephanie was full of drive and she was a thriving young girl. Her teachers and peers admired her for her dedication and positive attitude. Stephanie developed an interest in business and real estate. She was fascinated by the property market and the dynamics of buying and selling homes. And that interest is what later influenced her decision to pursue a career in real estate. So it's 1992. Stephanie is a thriving 25-year-old. She has a boyfriend and she has a decent social life, close friends, and she was taking steps in pursuing her dream career. Stephanie began working as an estate agent at Shipways Estate Agency. Shipways was a well-known firm in her area of Birmingham. Stephanie's role at Shipways involved showing properties to potential buyers, conducting market research, and generally assisting with the sales process. Although Stephanie had only been working there for 6 weeks, she quickly established herself as a competent and dedicated estate agent. Her colleagues and clients appreciated her for her professionalism. She paid attention to detail, and she just had this natural ability to connect with people. She was known for her reliability and her knack for understanding clients' needs, which gives an even bigger question as to why Stephanie, a successful estate agent who seemingly loves her job and is experienced at what she does, how does she just leave the office for a viewing and never come back? Where had she gone? It wasn't until they received a phone call that they realised it was time to get the police involved. That morning, it would have been what you'd call a normal work day, but there was something different about it, and that was down to an appointment in the diary for a house viewing, which might not sound out of the ordinary, except this appointment was made by letter and not by phone. Some people would, call up and book an appointment viewing by phone. Some would show up, but they certainly wouldn't make an appointment viewing by letter. And this was a request by letter from a Bob Southall, and no follow-up call came afterwards, so they hadn't really had a confirmation for this booking. And because this was sounding like it wasn't going to go ahead, Stephanie offered to take the viewing, so freeing up her other colleagues to go attend a different viewing. Really, they were expecting a no-show from this guy. But either way, Stephanie took one for the team, made her way over to the house, and it was only 2 minutes away from the agency. And this was a house on Turnberry Road. At 10:30 a.m, Stephanie arrived. And to her slight surprise, it was going ahead. She met a man at the property. She addresses him as Mr. Southall. He gave a nod. Yep, okay, that's him. And they entered the house to start the viewing. As they looked around downstairs, Stephanie got the impression that he really wasn't interested in that property. This house had been vacant for a while, and although he seemed to show some interest at the start, she started to get the feeling that he wasn't going to go for it. To get the appointment over and done with, Stephanie leads the man, Mr. Southall, upstairs to finish showing off the rest of the house. She allows him to have a look around while she waits in one of the bedrooms. She's getting a bit fed up. She starts wandering down the stairs, just hoping that this is over and done with already, so she can go warm up a bit back at the office. But it was then the man sparks an interest in something in the bathroom. So he asked Stephanie to explain what it was that he was looking at. So she walks into the bathroom and takes a look at what it was, and it was a hook on the wall. He was looking at a hook on the wall. She's thinking, what is so complicated about that? And as she turns around, the man suddenly lunges at her. Stephanie doesn't know what is going on. This man is a full grasp, basically trying to wrestle her to the ground. She's trying her hardest to fight this man off of her. She realizes that he's got a knife and a chisel in his hands while he's grabbing her, and Stephanie is trying her hardest to fight him off. He's not that big in stature, but he's just too frenzied to overpower in this moment. Through the struggle, Stephanie manages to grab the chisel that he was holding, and then she grabs the knife, and her grip was relentless on this knife. She was doing everything in her power to make sure that that knife didn't get anywhere near her. But this wasn't enough to stop the man from overpowering her. Her hair was pulled back and the knife was pulled from her grip. And so Stephanie began to beg, okay, you've got me. She started pleading, please don't harm me. Please remember, I'm human. And this sort of did something for a minute. The man took a step back from her, calming down from the frenzy, but unfortunately he came with a plan, and he wasn't going to stop there. He bound Stephanie's hands together and put a rope around her neck, and Stephanie was led out of the house like this in broad daylight. Shock and fear consumed her as any chance of escaping or running away was now gone. It was as if her body was paralysed in shock, and before she could even pull herself into the reality and try and save herself, she was in the back of the car blindfolded, and just like that, Stephanie was gone. Stephanie was in the back of this man's car, being driven what seemed miles upon miles away from home. The unknown to her was absolutely terrifying. Stephanie tried to keep track of which way they turned, what she could hear, what surroundings she could make sense of. She's completely tied up and blindfolded, so in her mind, anything that she can remember or make sense of, she was going to try her hardest to memorise. Back at the office, her colleagues were clearly confused as to why Stephanie wasn't back yet. Her supervisor, Kevin Watts, had driven past her car still parked outside the address that she was showing that morning, and this was about an hour and a half after the appointment was scheduled. So, obviously, he thought it was a bit odd, but nothing really worried him about it. He guessed there must have been a reason that the appointment wasn't over yet, so he just left. The phone rang in the office, so Sylvia, one of the agents, picked up, and as soon as the call ended, she rang Kevin in a panic, and she told him Stephanie has been kidnapped. He's sending a ransom note in the post tomorrow, and if we call the police, she will die. Kevin rushes over to the house on Turnberry Road, and to his horror, he did see spots of blood and hair in the keychain in the hallway, which looked like Stephanie's, so he is in a panic. He calls the police. So the police have been called, and meanwhile Stephanie is being driven miles away. She's kidnapped at the back of this man's car, and hours later they finally came to a stop. Stephanie was sat upright in the car to be given the news by her attacker that she had been kidnapped. I mean, yeah, I'm sure she'd realised that by now, but he told that she'd actually been kidnapped for ransom, and he would be demanding £175,000 from Shipways. They'd pay £175,000 for Stephanie's safe return, and Stephanie herself was expected to help him carry out the plan to success. She was passed a pre-written ransom note to read out while he voice recorded it. He went off to a nearby phone box, called up Shipways, and played down the phone to Kevin on the other end. Thankfully, the police were taking the kidnapping very seriously and wanted to do all that they can to try and make sure that they found his safe. Police found blood near the kitchen, up the stairs, and in the bathroom, as well as clear signs that there was a struggle in the house that she was showing. And now, there were phone calls coming in. At around 6 p.m, Stephanie's parents were notified of what's going on, devastating them with the unknown of where she possibly was or what could have possibly happened to her. But they vowed to stay strong and do all that they could to help police find Stephanie. They wanted to bring her home safely. Everybody involved wanted to bring her home safely. Police set up wire traps to the phones at Shipways and to the phones in her parents' house. And at the office and at Stephanie's parents, police were on guard for the next communication. It had been hours since Stephanie was taken, and in the back of the car she was absolutely terrified, not knowing where they were going, who this guy was, what he was going to do with her, and her attempts at keeping track of where they were going, it just wasn't going to suffice if she made this out alive. They had been driving for hours. They made a few short stops along the way to make the ransom call. Stephanie was given a small bite to eat and a drink, but apart from that, she spent the whole time bound and shoved down in the back of the car. She had absolutely no idea where they were. They would eventually reach their final stop, but this doesn't bring Stephanie any relief. Yes, they weren't driving anymore, but she was over 70 miles away from home. Stephanie was led out of the car and into the cold, wintry air. She is still blindfolded, so she doesn't know where she's going, but she can feel the gravel crunch beneath her feet as she walks out of the car and into a building. The eerie sounds of a heavy metal door being pushed open as she's led through into a cold and echoey room is the only thing that she is aware of right now. Stephanie thought she must have entered a warehouse or some kind of workshop from the sounds that she was hearing. After being led through the room, she was sat down and tied to a chair. He told her to take her clothes off, that he had something else for her to wear. Panic absolutely poured through Stephanie at this point. The idea of taking her clothes off in front of this man, well, she couldn't do it. She wouldn't do it. But he wasn't going to take no for an answer. And while he's demanding this, he is pushing the knife against her as well. So given that she was tied up, what could she really do? The man took Stephanie from the chair, pulled her arms up in the air, and threw her down onto a cold, hard mattress on the ground. And this is where it gets upsetting because, unfortunately, the man claiming to be called Bob Southall then proceeded to essay Stephanie. With warm tears streaming down her face, she laid on the cold, hard mattress being assaulted in that eerie, echoing cold room. She did everything in her power not to scream or shout. In her mind, she just didn't want to feed into some sort of fantasy for him, so she stayed silent, hoping and praying that the ordeal would just be over and done with. And once it was, he got up off of her, handed her some men's clothes to wear, and he muttered to Stephanie, "That won't happen again, not that it were much." Back home, Stephanie's family are understandably besides themselves. The West Midlands Police were all hands on deck and had joined forces with a neighbouring team to help investigate, and most importantly, do all that they can to bring Stephanie home safely. Unfortunately, at this time, all the investigators had to go off was the fact that an appointment had been made by letter to Shipways and that the colleague had received a phone call demanding money in place for Stephanie's return. But that is all that they knew. So where do they go from there? Do they just wait for the ransom note to arrive the next day? Time is of the essence, and there was no time to waste. While police got to work gathering witness statements, the kidnapper called Shipways again, and he let them know that Stephanie had dropped her keys over at Turnberry Road, so they'd better go lock it up. That is all he said. He hung up. They had the dial tone straight after that. He'd hung up the call. So the call wasn't even long enough for police to gather any location data from it, but they did have their first lead. The man talking, he had a northern accent. Witness statements told of a man seen outside the house that morning. They described him as kind of short, probably early 50s. Someone else witnessed a red van revving their engine by Turnberry Road, so they at least had something to work with this information. Back at the warehouse, Stephanie is dealing with the traumatic aftermath of being assaulted. The horror of what happened to her left her feeling empty and numb, like he had taken everything from her. He said to Stephanie, "I hope you're not claustrophobic." She simply shrugged her shoulders and said no. With that, Stephanie, still blindfolded, was told that she was going into a box inside of another box. Now, when he says box, it's pretty much a wheelie bin. In the UK, even the largest of standard wheelie bins are about 3.5 foot tall, so Stephanie was going to be seriously confined in this space. Stephanie was instructed to slide into the box, to squish herself down until she was in completely, which she struggled to do, but regardless of this, she was going in either way. Her body was twisted inside of the box and her arms were pulled above her head to be handcuffed to a bar. And above Stephanie's head would be boulders, so if she was to pull on the bar, they'd come down and crush her to death. Stephanie suddenly felt a sharp pain down her right leg. She cried out in pain. He said that they were electrodes, and if she was to move around, the electrodes would electrocute her and kill her instantly. So Stephanie had no choice but to stay frozen still. Stuffed down, twisted, laying awkwardly in this confined space. She was just left there. The following day, Thursday the 23rd of January, Shipways received a letter as promised, and inside was a cassette tape. And after confirming with Warren and Betty that it was Stephanie's voice on the recording, they began assessing the correspondence. The recording of Stephanie said that she was okay and unharmed, and as long as the instructions are followed, she will be released on Friday the 31st of January. The kidnapper demanded a ransom of £175,000 to be delivered by Stephanie's supervisor Kevin Watts in his own vehicle on Wednesday the 29th of January. A secret major incident room was set up with analysts to build a profile of the kidnapper, and all of the police and the investigators involved basically had a gag order going on. No one was to speak of what was going on to anyone outside of the investigation. The media was not going to be reporting on the kidnapping, and they didn't want anything to spook the kidnapper and put Stephanie in any more danger than she already was. His letters are being scrutinised extensively, down to the misspelling of words, such as spelling ransom with an E. The task force is growing ever bigger as specialists are being brought in to do what they can to help. West Yorkshire Police are concerned with some similarities between the ransom note West Midlands Police have received to the one that they had received in a separate case from the previous year. They stepped in to gather information on Stephanie's kidnapping to see if they could possibly be a link with them. Because, unfortunately, the case that West Yorkshire were dealing with, that one ended in murder. There was just an intense pressure to take the right steps here, just in case they were linked. Inside the box, Stephanie is freezing cold. It's January in the UK, and it is so cold, especially in the nights. You typically need warm clothes, extra layers, as well as a central heating or a fire to warm the room. And Stephanie is inside of a cold warehouse in men's clothing, laying dead still, not to set off any of these traps that are around her. So she starts feeling herself going into hypothermia. She's petrified to shiver too much or accidentally pull down on the bar above her head. But as she's succumbing to the temperatures, Stephanie loses the will to worry anymore. And she doesn't care if she dies at this point, if it means not being there for him in the morning. She feels like she's losing her mind, being in complete darkness, freezing cold, uncomfortable and in pain. She starts to see a white light appear in front of her eyes. A sense of comfort beholds her as she sees the face of Christ in the white light. Her body and mind suddenly feels at ease. She feels herself slipping into death. But she was simply falling asleep. A few hours later, Stephanie is pulled out of the box. The man seemed shocked at the state that Stephanie was in after being in there all night. almost having to carry her to the chair. She could barely use her legs. And once she was in the chair, she was handed a cup of tea by the man. He seemed surprised to see that Stephanie could barely move her arms to drink the tea. She explained how cold she was in there, and with that, he took the tea away from her. But he started to rub Stephanie's arms to warm her from the friction. He was rubbing her arms and asking if it helped, and she said yes. So he carried on rubbing her arms to warm her up. She is confused by the sudden humility, seeing as she was brutally assaulted the day before. It seems something about seeing the state of her coming out of that box that morning, it made him half treat her as a human, if only for a minute, because she would be bound and blindfolded to that chair and later put back into the box to do it all over again. Back at home, Stephanie's parents were struggling to cope with her disappearance. The stress and devastation was just too overwhelming for them, and sadly, Stephanie's mum Betty had a seizure. On Sunday the 26th of January, it had been 5 days since Stephanie was kidnapped. Family liaison officers, as well as the police protection, they were all set up at Stephanie's parents' house, waiting patiently for the kidnappers' next move, but also helping Warren and Betty through the worrying time. It was in the afternoon that her parents received a call at the house, and when they answered, they could hear a pre-recorded message from Stephanie. And they hear Stephanie's voice say, "I'm all right and unharmed. I hear West Brom lost to Swansea yesterday 3-2. I want you to know that I love you. I'm not to say too much, but whatever the outcome, just know I'll always love you. Look after the cats for me." But Stephanie wasn't in a good way. She was spending her time in and out of the box, being completely blindfolded and bound the entire time. She had been in pitch darkness for almost a week, and dealing with mind games from the kidnapper, being treated terribly one minute and half decently another. When Stephanie was out of the box, sat with her legs bound to the chair, she would have conversations with the man. They'd talk about what they like on TV, other interests that she had, and at one point Stephanie had the man laughing. To this, he told her that he'd have to throw away the bin that he had ready to dispose of her body in. So this sent Stephanie into a huge panic. The realization of where she was and what was happening to her, just the realization that she was there to be killed, it was causing a huge panic response, and Stephanie began to beg. She was begging, calling out for the man. She was crying, "Bob, please, please don't kill me. Please, Bob." Tears soaking the blindfold, she began reaching out to hug the man for comfort. She was so terrified. Even the man who was putting her through this horrifying ordeal was able to hug and soothe her to some comfort, if only for a moment. It gets to Tuesday the 28th of January. It was 7 days into the kidnapping. Kevin Watts, Stephanie's supervisor, picks up a phone call at Shipways. With police there and recording devices ready to go, Kevin asks who was on the other end of the phone, and the voice said, "Never you mind, have you got the money for tomorrow? Kevin, have you got the money for tomorrow?" Obviously, he realizes it's the kidnapper. He asks back, "For tomorrow?" And the man reiterates, "For tomorrow, yeah. Have you got it?" Kevin tells him he's getting it, and to that he was given an instruction to expect a call around 3 p.m. the next day, which would indicate a drop-off day where Kevin was expected to go deliver the money for Stephanie's release. This call came at the end of the day before they closed for the night. So who knows whether Kevin got any sleep that night, but there would be something different to the way that Stephanie would be sleeping that night. She was brought out of the box and laid onto a mattress. She was given crisps and Kit Kats to eat that night, and the kidnapper, he was laying on another mattress next to her. They lay down together, but they're on separate mattresses for a while. And the man said to Stephanie, "What would you say if I asked you to do what we did on the first night?" Stephanie's realizing that he was referring to the essay that he committed on her, and she tells him, "I'd ask you not to ask that of me because I don't want to." She says this, but panic begins to pour throughout Stephanie again. But surprisingly, she was reassured because he said, "That's okay, just thought I'd ask." And he didn't try it again. The following morning, Wednesday the 29th of January, Kevin Watts was making his way back to Shipways to meet with the police and embark on what would be an extremely risky day of work. Kevin was briefed by the investigators. They had pulled together an enormous team, hundreds of investigative professionals, analysts, intelligence agents, surveillance, you name it, they were all hands on deck working on this investigation. Almost 1,000 of them were working on this investigation. Behind the scenes, the voice recordings and letters that had been sent had all been extensively scrutinised and analysed. The witness accounts that had been taken from the day of the kidnapping, all of the familiarities investigators had made between Stephanie's case and the murder case from last year that West Yorkshire Police were dealing with. The size of the team working behind the scenes was astronomical at this point. And now the day had come to meet the kidnappers' demands, and the police were going to have to tread extremely carefully, not only because they need to locate Stephanie and bring her home safely, but they now have Kevin's life in their hands should anything go wrong in the dropping off of the money. Kevin puts on a bulletproof vest, a two-way radio to communicate with the surveillance team along the way, and the bag of ransom money that police have carefully sewn a tracker into to keep tabs on Kevin, but also to follow that bag once it's been handed over to the kidnapper, hoping that this will lead them to Stephanie. The enormous team of surveillance officers were ready to go, with their own plan in place to keep an eye on Kevin and an eye on that bag of ransom money. They followed Kevin's car, staying inconspicuous, not to be seen. The police aren't supposed to be involved in any of this, but they are keeping very close tabs on Kevin. Just after 3 p.m, the phone rang in Shipways, so Kevin bravely picks up and gets his instructions from the kidnapper. He has to drive to Glossop railway station and to answer a phone call at 7 p.m. from the payphone outside the entrance. Glossop is just over 2 hours drive north up the M6 from Great Barr, so bearing in mind, Stephanie is almost a 2 hours drive east of Glossop. When Kevin arrived at the station to accept the phone call at 7 p.m, the kidnapper told him to walk along to the next phone box where he'll find an envelope taped under the shelf. So he walked out the station entrance, found the envelope waiting for him in the next phone box, and when he opened it up, there were further instructions to drive 22 miles away in Sheffield to the next phone box where he had another envelope waiting for him. There was added pressure for Kevin to arrive safely and on time to each of these locations. The weather had taken a turn for the worst, and the driving conditions were considerably poor due to thick fog and downpours of rain. Kevin was panicked reaching the next phone box because he arrived there a lot later than anticipated because of the weather, but he found the envelope and he read his further instructions. He was to turn off the main road and drive slowly down the path until he came to a small building with a traffic cone. Close to that would be a bag for the money to be deposited into. So Kevin gets back into the car and starts to drive, but this would only be as far as the undercover surveillance officers could follow Kevin if they wanted to remain unseen by the kidnapper. He could have been anywhere nearby at this point, so they had to hold back. They're still treading on eggshells as to not making the wrong move and causing the kidnapper to react in a harmful way to either Stephanie or Kevin, because Kevin is taking a huge risk by making this journey supposedly on his own, though police are listening and following close by. They've got that two-way radio and the tracking device in the bag. And by now, the pressure is ever mounting for Kevin. This has been going on for pretty much the entire day since he first left his family at home to come out on this mission, and it just seems never ending with the games that the kidnapper seems to be playing. As Kevin follows the directions, and this is without the surveillance team following behind in their vehicles anymore, he's met with a traffic cone and a handwritten signage with arrows and Shipways on them. He knows where he is. He's obviously going the right way. He's following along on a footpath in the pitch dark. It was around 9 p.m. at this point. He finds a traffic cone with a note attached. He was to put the money into the bag provided, then he would need to search for a tray set up on a nearby wall. The tray will have a sensor on it to detect any police interference. As long as the sensor didn't go off when he placed the money down on the tray, he could go. So when Kevin found the tray with a device laid on it, he was ready to drop off this ransom money, get this over and done with, so he could go home. Using the two-way radio, Kevin lets the surveillance officers know where and how far down the path he is, and the time's come, he's ready, all hands on deck, he's ready to make the drop-off. But he gets no response. The signal was lost, the two-way radios, they weren't connected to each other. He realizes they probably don't even know where he is right now, but he has to do it. With no reassurance or guidance from any surveillance, Kevin has no choice but to make the drop without them, and thankfully, no sound was heard when the money was placed. So Kevin ran back to the car, flew out of there as quick as he could, radioing that he's dropped the money off and to get ready to take chase with the kidnapper when he goes to retrieve it. But not even the hiccup with the radio making it so they completely missed this drop. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that, unbeknownst to everyone, the drop had been made on a bridge, and that bridge had the kidnapper below, waiting, ready to simply pull on a rope attached to the tray. And when he pulled on that rope, he instantly retrieved the money and he shot off on his moped. That was it. He had succeeded in his ransom plan. No chance police were going to find him at this stage. And this had all happened before the police even realised that the money is dropped. He is gone. Stephanie's location and status of whether she remained safe and unharmed, it was completely unknown to every person working on the investigation. Stephanie's parents were besides themselves petrified. At this point, the kidnapper has gotten what he's wanted, and they don't even know if she's going to be released unharmed. What happens next shocks everyone. Frantic banging could be heard on Warren and Betty's front door. The doorbell was ringing over and over, so the liaison officer went to answer. And with Stephanie's dad Warren wearily following behind as the door opened, Warren reached past the officer and grabbed the person at the door by the coat, pulling them in as hard as they could to the house. It was Stephanie. Although the kidnapper's plan was to murder and dispose of her once receiving the money, something about the way that Stephanie had composed herself over the 8 days that she was captured changed the way that his mind worked. And now he didn't want anything bad to happen to her at all. He had the idea to drop her off to a phone box to call the police, equipping her with a knife for protection, but he wanted to make sure that Stephanie got home safe, so he was taking her home himself. Unfortunately, the police were not stationed outside the property at the time Stephanie was brought home, so there was another opportunity missed. They were yet to apprehend her kidnapper, but now Stephanie was home, she was safe. And the media was going wild with this story. There was officially a manhunt in the UK to find this man, find this kidnapper, and bring him into custody. Stephanie poured out to investigators everything that had gone on during her 8 days of captivity, that she could hear people coming in, coming out. There were people coming and going the whole time that she was there. She could hear a till being used, what he sounded like, what they talked about. She was telling all of this to investigators. They were getting a much bigger picture of who this person might be. But Stephanie had been blindfolded the entire time, so they had to rely on the eyewitness description of the man on the morning of the kidnapping. But it was enough to compose a photo fit. And on the 20th of February 1992, an episode was put out on BBC's Crime Watch regarding Stephanie's case. Crime Watch as a show started in 1984 in the UK, and its main purpose was to show reenactments of crimes, show CCTV images or footage, composite photos, basically appealing to the general public for any further information that they might have involving any of the crimes that they featured, and asking them to call the hotline to provide potential leads. So on Stephanie's episode, they played the recordings of the phone calls they'd received over the course of her captivity. Alongside this was the photo fits created from the eyewitness and a small description of his height and his age. It was all presented, and good old Crime Watch back in the UK in the 90s, if Crime Watch was on, you were probably tuning in. Susan Oakes was tuned in that night, and she called the hotline to tell them, "That sounds exactly like my ex-husband." So police thought the least they could do was check out this lead. They drove to Barrel Hill Road, Sutton-on-Trent, Nottinghamshire, where a lady named Tina answered the door. She explained, "Well, my husband won't be back till 5, but we did watch the Crime Watch episode yesterday, and he said to expect a knock at the door." She sent investigators to her husband's place of work at the Swan and Salmon Yard, and there they made their introductions, with the man pretending to be named Bob Southall, a man matching the description from Crime Watch, a man working in a shop with a till and a backroom workshop with everything that Stephanie had described to have felt, a man who was confessing to kidnapping Stephanie and extorting money from shipways. A man called Michael Sams. Michael Sams ran a small repair shop in the Swan and Salmon Yard in Newark, and that was where Stephanie was being held captive. Throughout the days that Stephanie is confined to the box, Michael Sams would be out the front, laughing and joking with customers, ringing transactions through the till like nothing was amiss. And when you think about it, just the audacity of this man to be keeping Stephanie in a workshop, a room behind the front of house open to the public, where he would serve customers all day long. So many people would have walked in and out of that establishment over the course of a week, unbeknownst to the fact that there is a 25-year-old woman blindfolded and bound, stuffed into a coffin-like box in the room behind. The devastation that those customers must have felt when they realised that they'd visited there on those days that Stephanie was being held captive. The thought that they could have done something to help had they have known. And even his wife was bringing him lunch. Just the absolute audacity of it. Michael Sams was put through an intense interrogation with investigators. Through the interrogation, the police pointed out to him that there were similarities between the letters between what he had sent to shipways and letters that West Yorkshire Police were investigating from a case the year before. Through the interrogation, it was confirmed that, yes, Michael Sams had written all of those letters. And not only that, he'd also sent letters to British Rail with demands of £200,000 in a blackmailing scheme. So they caught him on that as well. But worst of all, he had murdered an 18-year-old girl in Leeds. The case that the West Yorkshire Police were investigating, the murder case, it was all confirmed that Michael Sams had murdered this poor 18-year-old girl. Julie Dart was going through a tough transition at the time of her kidnapping. She had a boyfriend that her mum didn't approve of, and although she had dreamed of joining the armed forces, having just failed her GCSEs, she had turned to S work. Sadly, the last time that Julie was seen by her mum, she told her mum that she was going to stay at a female friend's house, but really, she was going to stay with her boyfriend. And when she went to stay with her boyfriend, she told her boyfriend that she was going out to work. She was doing a late shift at the hospital. But she didn't work at the hospital. She was going out to work on the cold, dark streets. While out working the streets, 18-year-old Julie was approached by Michael Sams in the car, taking her to a car park near a college for them to engage in paid S. But when they got there, Julie was bound and blindfolded at knife point, and she was taken to the exact same workshop that Stephanie was, and was confined to the box. Michael Sams had sent a ransom letter to police, demanding £140,000, threatening to bomb a shopping centre and kill a prostitute if they didn't meet the demand. His words, not mine. But by the time that the letter had reached the police, Julie had already been murdered by him. Her body was found in a field close to a railway line. It wasn't until police began making the link between Julie's case and Stephanie's, when the ransom letters were analysed, that both could be at the hands of the same man, and that was all confirmed under interrogation. The following year, in 1993, Michael Sams was sentenced to 4 life sentences for kidnapping, false imprisonment, blackmail, and murder. And coming up to 80 years old, he remains in prison to this day. After the fact, Stephanie struggled with the psychological damage caused during her kidnapping. It took a while for her to feel herself again. For years, she dealt with back pain as a result of being kept in the box. After moving to the Isle of Wight, Stephanie began working with trainee police and giving seminars about the treatments of victims of crime. The ongoing investigation after her return took a huge toll on Stephanie, with no emotional support or counselling from the police, just an insistent want for information from her. She wanted a more even balance between the treatment of victims following a crime of this nature, looking after the welfare of the victim, alongside having to spend what seems like endless time reliving the nightmare through extensive police investigation. Through this work with the police, Stephanie felt a sense of purpose, being able to help others, giving insight to the mind of a victim, providing feedback to how the police operate, and being a voice of change. She wrote a book about her experience to inspire women to have strength. But Stephanie was able to find some happiness in her life after moving to the Isle of Wight. She was living close to the sea and sharing her life with her pet dogs and cats. But sadly, Stephanie passed away in 2017 after a short battle with cancer. She was just 50 years old. Her parents, Warren and Betty, had passed away in the years before. Thank you so much for listening. Today's Rotten Wrong'un was Michael Sam's. Head to our website for more details. I cannot wait to see you next time. Bye.